I started last night with a brief introduction to emphasize that before midnight there is a message, and if you're not fully following this message, you won't understand that this is an argument. Does this light that's represented by the seventh seal come after midnight or before midnight? And so what I was dealing with up here, I'm going to erase this, but I'll give you an idea of what went on last night. Based upon the seven thunders of Millerite history, you can also plug in the work of Samuel Snow in developing the message of the Midnight Cry into that same history and see seven significant waymarks in that history. The first one being in May of 1843, William Miller pens an understanding that he has that the Lord's going to return in the fall of the year based upon the feast of the Lord. And Samuel Snow's going to use this point of reference to put together his understanding of the Midnight Cry. This is a line of Samuel Snow's work. Samuel Snow's going to write a letter in February of 1844 describing what he's finding, that is the argument that the Lord isn't going to return in 1843, it's already 1844, but that he's going to return October 22nd, 1844. This letter gets published in a Millerite periodical here, so this is the development of Samuel Snow's work. Then you have the first disappointment. The Cariite year of 1843 ends, and on April 19th, 1844, you have the first day of 1844, the first disappointment. This is significant to our study today because it's at this point that technically the Lord removes his hand from the mistake on that chart. The singular mistake is the way that Sister White describes it, and it was their understanding of the fullness of the year. They weren't calculating in the full year concept, and this is what Samuel Snow is going to do. This is going to be one of his primary arguments, that it's not just 2,300 years, it's 2,300 full years. And as we've looked over the past couple of years at the work of Samuel Snow, we hadn't paid too close attention that on May 2nd, is 5 May? Yes, May 2nd, 1844, that Samuel Snow's understanding, which is the Midnight Cry message, was first published. Okay, what our attention was drawn to is that the first time that Samuel Snow publicly preached this message was at the Boston Tabernacle on July 21st, 1844, and then 25 days later at the Exeter camp meeting. When we saw this, as we were studying these prophetic lines 2-3 years ago, whenever it was, this become very significant because it's opening up the truth that before the Midnight Cry is proclaimed at the Exeter camp meeting, the Millerites reached a point in their history which they identified as midnight. And Sister White agrees with this, but she uses the expression midway. She says, and this is a paraphrase, midway between when we first thought the Lord would return and the time when we afterward understood that he would return, the message of the Midnight Cry was proclaimed. And they thought the Lord would return in 1843, so this is the starting point that Sister White's referring to, midway between the time when we first thought he would return. April 19th, 1844, 1843 is past history. And thereafter, they understood he was going to return on October 22nd, 1844. If you count those days and you go to the dead center of those days, you come to July 21st. And on July 21st, Samuel Snow, for the first time, presents the Midnight Cry message publicly in Boston, the Boston Tabernacle. I think there was 3,000 people there. 25 days later, he's presenting the identical message at the Exeter camp meeting. Typically, if Seventh-day Adventists know anything at all about Samuel Snow and the Midnight Cry message, they'll know about the Exeter camp meeting. Most of us as Seventh-day Adventists here at the end of the world, we don't know anything about it. But if we know about the Exeter camp meeting, you know, there's a feather in our cap. But we don't know much about the fact that he presented it first at Boston here. And it's only recently, and it's because of our lack of study. Sister White says that because we're not studying, the Lord allows heresies to come in among us. The Omega apostasy has come into this movement, and there are things that are being taught by men that used to work hand in hand with us that have forced certain issues to be more carefully looked at, and one of them is that they're arguing that the light that comes to this particular movement at the very end comes after midnight, and therefore, because of this discussion, some people dove into that consideration and recognized that on May 2nd, that would be June, July, a little bit over 2 months before the first public presentation by Samuel Snow had printed the Midnight Cry message in a Millerite publication. That being evidence that there is and this is being called a prediction before midnight, PBM for short. There's a prediction before midnight, and last night I reminded us that the first midnight cry was in Exodus at the Passover, when there was a cry at midnight because all the firstborn were slain, firstborn for anyone that didn't have the blood on the doorpost. But Moses, before that event, had told Pharaoh, this is what's about to happen. So the first reference of the midnight cry includes a prediction before midnight about what's going to happen. And Samuel Snow's prediction here that he presented here and here came to pass here, although he misunderstood where the Lord was coming to. We're not dealing with that. So identifying this history of Samuel Snow as the midnight cry from the premise that Millerite history is repeated to the very letter says that we will have a midnight cry message in our history because Jesus illustrates the end with the beginning, and Samuel Snow and William Miller are the beginning of Adventism, and we're the end of Adventism. So if we're going to repeat that history to the very letter, and there's several passages that teach that principle, then before the door closes for us, because very few people argue that the prophetic closing of the door in the Millerite history was October 22nd, 1844. Not only is the door to the holy place closed at that point in time, but the door in the parable of the 10 virgins is closed at that time. Therefore, when our door closes here at the end of Adventism, then what we're arguing is that there has to be a prediction before midnight. You all with me on that? Okay, now the secondary thing that in a point I tried to make last night is a point that I have taught a few times, and when I've taught it in the past, I'll take an entire sermon at least to teach this point, and I just threw it out there last night as I'm going to throw it out there again today. I'm not dealing with every aspect of it, but the point that I also put in place last night is that the Millerites understood, and I hope you understand too, that at the time of the end in 1798, based upon Daniel 12, the book of Daniel was unsealed and there was an increase of knowledge. But the Millerites understood that that very phenomenon of an increase of knowledge taking place when the book of Daniel was opened, based upon Daniel 12, is also represented in Revelation 5 and onward by the work of Christ taking the Bible, which is sealed with 7 seals, and unsealing the Bible, the light of the Bible, in a progressive way. The fact that Revelation talks about the Bible, and it doesn't say the Bible, you go in the spirit of prophecy to prove that it's the Bible, but the fact that Revelation says the Bible is sealed with 7 seals, and then Christ begins to remove those seals one at a time, among other things, is teaching us that it's a progressive development of truth. If he had wanted us to understand that it was just a singular truth that was opened up at the time of the end when the book of Daniel was unsealed, then there would have only been 1 seal on the Bible, and he would have removed it and the book would have been fully opened. Okay, so you can see in the 7 seals that get removed a corresponding truth to the book of Daniel being unsealed at the time of the end in 1798, and we gave a quote from James White from Review and Herald, November. This is James White, Review and Herald, November 1st, 1853, where he expresses the pioneer understanding that the unsealing of Daniel at the time of the end is the same as the Lion of the tribe of Judah in Revelation, removing those seals one at a time. So taking that principle that's a correct principle that the pioneers understood, if you take the Millerite history, which is also acceptable to define as the history of the seven thunders, Sister White says the seven thunders represent a delineation of events that transpired under the first and second angel's message. The first angel arrives in 1798. The second angel arrives on April 19th. And the third angel arrives on October 22nd, 1844. So when she says the seven thunders represents a delineation of events, the word delineate means to set forth upon a line. When she says the seven thunders represent a delineation of events that would transpire under the first and second angel's message, then she's talking about from here to here, because here's the arrival of the third. The history of 1798 to October 22nd, 1844 is the history of the first and second angel's message. That was the seven thunders. In that history, the Lion of the tribe of Judah test the people of that history with a progressive development of truth. And in Revelation 5 and onward, that progressive development of truth is identified as the removal of seven seals. That's what these are illustrating down here. But the first truth that was unsealed to the Millerites in 1798 is the judgment hour message, the first angel's message. William Miller was the representative of the first angel's message. We, at the end, repeating that history to the very letter, are the representatives of the third angel's message. The Millerites announced the opening of the judgment. We announce the close of the judgment. It's the same history, same work, only different. But when it comes to viewing this Millerite history as a progressive development of truth in the terms of seven seals, the first truth that was open was the judgment hour message. And in the first angel's message, in verse 7, is where we get this expression, judgment hour message. It says, and the time, how's it say it? Let's go to Revelation 14:7. I usually know that one. You probably know that one. If you want to just shout it out, go ahead. Revelation 14:7, it says, the hour of his judgment is come. Okay, that's why we call it the judgment hour message. The hour of his judgment is come. So Miller, he spends 2 years from 1816 to 1818 studying God's Word, and he forms his conclusions at this point, but he doesn't preach publicly, or his message doesn't go into the public arena until 1831. He sends a handwritten article into a newspaper in New Jersey, I think. I could be wrong. And they publish it in 1831. And later on in history, this has nothing to do with our presentation, but I like it. Later on, the Mormon Church buys up this newspaper in New Jersey or wherever it was. It's on the East Coast. And it becomes part of the historical archives of the Latter-day Saints, of the Mormons. So when Dwayne Dewey is trying to trace down the, pardon me?
Is that Harm's paper?
No, this is William Miller I'm talking about.
Right, but it was oh, okay, I thought you were saying that William Miller's article was printed in this New Jersey paper, and I was wondering if it was Harm's.
No, it was just a secular, secular organization, and I think it's in New Jersey, in 1831. That's the first time it's published. Okay, I shouldn't give the history, but anyway, when Dwayne Dewey is trying to trace this down, he traces it down that it was in this newspaper on the East Coast, and then he finds out that the Mormon Church had bought that newspaper, and so he checks with the Mormon Church to see if they have any archives from, almost 200 years ago, and sure enough, they do. So he obtains the original newspaper articles, but more than that, what's really cool is they kept William Miller's original handwritten article that they turned into this newspaper. So because Dwayne has that, I have that, and it's pretty cool. The first time that he publicly presented his message, and it was it was long. It's like his handwritten material is probably 30 pages long. But it comes into history in 1831, and you as a student of prophecy, you can pick 2 or 3 dates for the formalization of his message, okay? And 1831, first time it's public. 1833, he is ordained by the Baptist Church. 1834, he's ordained by all the Protestant churches on the East Coast. So this is the history where the message is formalized. And the point is that this message that's formalized here, if you're going to summarize it into one expression of what it is, it's a judgment hour message, okay? It's the truths that are on that chart on the left-hand side. Every one of those truths has the fingerprints of William Miller up on it. And so, my point is this. The first seal that is removed in this history is the first angel's message. And because Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning, sure enough, when you get to the last piece of light that comes to the Millerite history, which is the light of the midnight cry, that swells like a tidal wave, Sister White says, until the door closes, the last development of truth in the Millerite history is the midnight cry message by Samuel Snow. And all that it is, not saying all that it is in a derogatory fashion, but all that it is a perfection of the judgment hour message. Okay, it's taking what William Miller, everything William Miller said was going to take place in 1843, and it's brought to perfection because Samuel Snow says, no, the real date for it is October 22nd, 1844. Okay. Now the reason that we put that in place is because we're saying that in our history, the judgment hour message that's opened up for us is Daniel 11, 40 to 45. They didn't understand exactly what was going to happen with their message. They thought the Lord was returning to the earth. But in reality, the Lord was beginning the investigative judgment. Okay? And so when this message comes to light, we really don't understand all the implications of what this is. But it's recognized right from the start. There's an argument right from the start about this message. When this message is presented publicly in 1996, even before 1996, here in this, here in this area in Eatonville, there was a ministry, Hope International, and they printed a monthly newsletter. And any of you that used to get that newsletter, you can give testimony that it was a rare thing indeed that their newsletters came out on a monthly basis. They were supposed to, but they never did. They were always running behind. And I'm not making fun of them because we're supposed to have a monthly newsletter. We don't get it out on time anymore either. We did for a long time, but we don't. So I'm not being derogatory. But in 1995 was one of the years, maybe the only year, that they produced a newsletter every month on time. And there was one article in each monthly newsletter for that year that went over the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, and when it was all said and done, we took those 12 articles and we turned them in to the Time of the End magazine that was published in 1996. And in that year that preceded that, every element of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 was battled over, okay? They would have an editorial committee before they were going to publish a magazine, and you'd go in and you'd look at all the articles, all the editors would read it and give their commentary on whether it was worth putting into the magazine or if this theological aspect was correct or not, or whatever, or should this be removed or this should be added. And it was usually just kind of rubber stamp. But when it came to Daniel 11, 40 to 45, it was a battle every month. And I mean, it would be, instead of having an hour-long editorial committee, it would be several hours. So all the aspects of Daniel 11, 40 to 45, they were hammered out, but we didn't understand all the implications. But the main battle from the very start and what continued all the way through was an understanding that the Adventists are still struggling with. We understood that in 1989 the Soviet Union collapsed in fulfillment of Daniel 11 verse 40, and that the next thing to happen was verse 41, which was a Sunday law in the United States, at which point probation closed for Seventh-day Adventists, and there's where the battle is. No Seventh-day Adventist wants to acknowledge that their probation closes at the Sunday law. So they're battling that, and then what I would add to that is, well, technically it closes at the Sunday law, but in reality our probation closes before the Sunday law, because we have to have a character prepared for the mark of the beast or the seal of God before that crisis hit. So that was even worse. Okay, not only is our probation over at the Sunday law, but in reality we've settled into the truth, or we've settled into error before that crisis. So that was always a battle. Okay, now I didn't say anything about this last night, but I'll throw it in here for your own knowledge. In this history here, right after October 22nd, 1844, Sister White began receiving criticism. I mean, these Millerite Adventists, they're professing to have a prophet. Not only do they profess now to have a prophet, it's a woman, and not only is it a woman, it's a teenage girl, okay? So they're all coming down on Sister White, all the critics, and one of the things they're taking her to task for is that the Millerites before October 22nd, 1844, based upon William Miller's understanding, he said when you get to that point, probation's closed for mankind, okay? So there was, and that was Millerite understanding. So there they realized after October 22nd, 1844, that probation hadn't closed for all mankind, so there they have her. They have Ellen White before October 22nd, 1844, believing and teaching that probation closed on October 22nd, 1844 for all mankind. And they started attacking her on her understanding of the shut door theory, but Sister White never took that position. She says, before that time, I held that understanding as all Millerites did. She says, but I never taught it, and the Lord never told me that in vision. She says, I've always believed in a shut door doctrine, and I still do. And then she goes in and explains it. So my point for going into this without getting into the details of the shut door controversy that takes place shortly after October 22nd, 1844, and Sister White writes a lot about the shut door controversy, is that here in this history we had a shut door controversy, and right here at the start we have a shut door controversy. We still have it with Seventh-day Adventists. Oh, Brother Jeff, God loves us too much to close our probation at the Sunday law. You know, I've heard that for 20-some years. Okay, but now, as we're getting to the end down here, to midnight in our history, we have another shut door controversy. Okay, does probation close at midnight? Yes, is the answer. But there's men now teaching that, well, and this is their words, probation sort of closes at midnight, but it closes all the way thereafter. Okay, so there's another shut door controversy. What I'm wanting you to see is when you deal with this subject in the spirit of prophecy, when she's dealing with the shut door controversy of her day and age, there's a passage where, in order to make her point, she says there was a shut door in the time of Noah. And she says there was a shut door in the time of Abraham. She says there was a shut door in the time of Christ. So she's emphasizing, she gives more than 3 witnesses, but all you need is 2 or 3 to establish something. Then in every one of these reform movements, there's a shut door issue that goes on. Okay, so we're now coming to the conclusion of that, but in any case, this shut door issue was part of the beginning of this work. It's part of the end of this work. What I'm saying is that shut door, for the Millerites, a shut door was announcing the opening of the judgment, okay, because they're the beginning of Adventism. But our shut door issue is announcing the close of judgment, because we're at the end. It's the judgment hour message all over again. But with the Millerites, though they did not understand it all, they're announcing the opening of the judgment. We're announcing the close of the judgment, and the place that the Lord took us to see the close of judgment was Daniel 11, 40 to 45. There's a classical passage, classical in the sense of this movement, that we use to define prophecy, where Sister White says, Historical events were set before the people, and prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this earth's history. Historical events were set before the people, and when they were set before the people, then the people understood that prophecy is a delineation of events. Prophecy are events that are on a line. Historical events were set before the people, and prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events. These events that are on this line are figurative, pointing forward to a repetition at the end of the world. But the only way you can see these events is to recognize the historical events that are taking place to prove that prophecy is being fulfilled. The reason that I'm putting this little thought in place is when this message began to be presented in the mid-1990s, it was saying that in 1989, the Soviet Union had been swept away through an alliance between the United States and the Vatican, and that was a historical event that everyone in the world was familiar with. Okay? And you'll find that the historical events that fulfill prophecy are not obscure historical events. Okay? We're marking 9/11 as one of the waymarks in our history, not an obscure historical event. It's a large historical event. It's set before the people, and they can recognize, if they want to exercise faith, that these events are a fulfillment of prophecy. So we were using the collapse of the Soviet Union as the historical event. Not that we were purposely, we were just presenting it. But that's the hook that allowed the people that wanted to see the truth of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 to see it. Is they could see, what they're saying about the Soviet Union collapsing in 1989 and the alliance between the United States and Vatican, it's all there in verse 40. You can see the symbolism of those words in those verses agreeing with that history. So what the point of this is, if I haven't lost you all, is that we're repeating Millerite history to the very letter. And the first message in the Millerite history was the Judgment Hour message. That would be the first seal in the terms of the line of the tribe of Judah. And the last development of truth in the Millerite history is the Midnight Cry message, which is the perfection of this message, and it agrees with the truth that Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. Therefore, in our history, the first message of this reform movement is the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. So when we get down here to the repetition of the Midnight Cry message, we should expect to see a perfection of our understanding of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. Not only should we see a perfection of these verses, but I also want to include the fact that the perfection that Samuel Snow accomplished was that he demonstrated that 1843 was incorrect and that October 22nd, 1844 was correct. And he demonstrated that in conjunction with the teaching that the Lord had purposely held his hand over a truth on that chart. He held his hand over one truth. That's why when Sister White speaks about it, she says mistake, singular. And she says, because of that mistake, it impacted some of the figures, plural. And the figures that were impacted was the 2520 and the 2300-year prophecy. They didn't see the fullness of the year, so they thought both of those prophecies concluded in 1843. But the Lord removed his hand from that mistake, the fullness of year error, and in so doing, it allows him to lead Samuel Snow to the conclusion of October 22nd, 1844. And I'm saying that verse 10 of Daniel 11 is what has been typified by the Lord removing his hand. Because when you look at Daniel 11, verse 10, you see the mistake that we made when we published the Time of the End magazine in 1996. And the mistake that we made is that when we understood the Soviet Union as being swept away in 1989, we saw Mikhail Gorbachev go from the leader of the Soviet Union to work at the United Nations. And we understood that correctly that the King of the South is a dragon power. And we understood that of the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet, of those three powers, two of them never move and one moves. Okay, the beast, the papacy, it's always geographically located in the city of Rome when it's ruling. Okay, the fact when it's moved out of the city of Rome is when it receives its deadly wound. But it's always in Rome. That's the beast. The false prophet is the United States. And whether it's the Protestants of the United States at the beginning of the history of the United States or apostate Protestantism that exists today in the United States, it's always the United States. But not so with the dragon. The dragon moves through history. The rebellion of the dragon begins in heaven. It comes down to Adam and Eve in the garden. It's there at the Tower of Babel. It's still in Babel when Babylon falls and the Chaldeans flee to Pergamus, where Revelation tells us that's where Satan's seat is, in Pergamus. And when that religion moves from the Chaldean Babylon to Pergamus, there comes a point in time when pagan Rome is conquering the world, and it conquers Pergamus and it takes the religion of Pergamus and it brings it back to the Pantheon Temple in the city of Rome. So you can show that the dragon power, it's always moving through history, whereas the beast and the false prophet, they're always in the same geographical area. So when we saw the Soviet Union collapse in 1989 and we see the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, take a position at the United Nations, we already understood that the United Nations was the last dragon power for lots of reasons, but an easy one to see is Testimonies to Ministers, page 38, where Sister White says, kings, governors, and rulers have taken upon themselves the brand of Antichrist and are represented as the dragon that goes to make war with the saints. So we knew that at the end of the world, the dragon power that persecutes God's people is a body of politicians, kings, governors, and rulers. It wasn't a singular nation. Kings plural, governors plural. That's the United Nations. So in this history here, when we see the Soviet Union, the King of the South, the dragon power, swept away in 1989, and we see its leader cease to be the leader of the Soviet Union and move on to a job in the United Nations, we make the assumption, okay, the King of the South is swept away. He does not exist any longer. He's moved to the United Nations. And we held to that understanding until December of last year, when the Lord removed his hand from verse 10 of Daniel 11. Okay? So last night, to add a couple more thoughts, part of what Dave was saying in the introduction, I don't know how to convey this to you, but there isn't any special light that I've had or our ministries had in advance of things. I don't know how to say that, okay? There's some things we've seen prophetically that indicate something's going to happen in advance, perhaps, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, when Kathy and I started a Bible study in our home in California in the 1980s, we had a Bible study going in our home for a regular basis. For whatever reason, no matter what pastor they would send to that church, I'd end up getting alienated from them. And during that time period, I was so alienated from this one pastor that we were having Bible studies in our home, okay? And we used to have them on a Wednesday night, and because we didn't know any better, and then when we got the flack for that, we switched them to another night, and we'd always have Sabbath afternoon Bible studies. And there came a point in time, and this was before we had computers, where I came across a passage in Selected Messages, and I was so amazed by it, what I was seeing in there, that for our Bible study, I took and typed in each paragraph from that chapter, and under each paragraph, I put questions, okay? And that's what we studied in our group for a really long time, and that was the prophetic pattern. That's what brings this out, okay? And years later, I run into a brother that had been in those studies with us, and I remembered that during the time we were studying, he was married in our backyard, okay? So I asked him at a meeting, and this is like 2005, 2006, when did you and Michelle get married? And he says, 1989. Pardon me? I forgot. Okay, old age. So in 1989, we had confirmation years after that in 89 is when he was opening up the line upon line. And thereafter, he opens up Daniel 11, 40 to 45. I now understand that you have to have both of these truths in place. The Lord had to put both of them in place in order to unfold this truth here at the end of the world. And so that's what this is up here. In 1991 is my best guess on when we began to study the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. It's noteworthy that the Lord was calling other people to understand these things, and other people left that truth, okay? A guy challenged me because I knew what he had taught on the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 was wrong. He challenged me to go home and study it, and I went home and I started studying it. And about that time I got invited, I was living in California, I got invited up here to a meeting that was going on from several self-supporting ministries were there. And there was a ministry called Light Bearers that was there, and they were coming to this meeting to leave self-supporting work. They were coming to, the Heartland was there, of course Hope was there, and Russell from Australia was there, and even Evan Sadler was there. All kinds of self-supporting ministries from all over the world were here in Eatonville. And the Light Bearers was coming to say, you're all wrong. You need to return to the General Conference. We've written a new book explaining why tithes should only go to the General Conference, and we're returning to the General Conference. So at that meeting, I was only up here because there was a friend of mine working at Hope International, and he invited me up, and I had some time off, so I came up here. It's long before I came up here and worked. And I came across a tract that Light Bearers had written about the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, and they're reaching the same conclusions that I'm reaching, okay? They're the same conclusions. So I actually talked with the one brother that wrote it at that meeting about it, but he couldn't get out of verse 40. He could not get out of verse 40 because he had taken the Adventist understanding that the glorious line is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so all I'm saying this for is that at the very beginning of this message, there were people that the Lord was calling into this message, typifying that at the end of this message, people that have been called into this message are going to jump ship, because Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. And we're seeing that going on now in the Omega apostasy. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if I said too much for you to follow the logic, what I'm saying is that the judgment hour message in the Millerite history is brought to perfection in the message of the midnight cry. And I'm saying in the terms of the 7 seals that the judgment hour message would be the first seal and the midnight cry would be the 7th seal. And the judgment hour message for the Millerites was announcing the opening of the judgment. And you can see that in Daniel 8:14 and Revelation 14:6 and 7. There's 2 verses that clarify the judgment hour message for William Miller, and Leviticus 26 and other passages. But for us, the judgment hour message that was opened up is Daniel 11:40 to 45, because it's announcing that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 in fulfillment of verse 40, and the next thing that's going to happen to you and I as Seventh-day Adventists is our probation is going to close at the Sunday law in the United States. Okay, it's the judgment hour message in that context, but it's not announcing the close or the opening of the judgment, it's announcing the close of judgment. But when you get to the technical part of this message, technical in this one level, I want you to see that this message is not only Daniel 11:40 to 45, the very first thing that was taught was the reform lines in 1989. And you have to have that reform line in place to put the structure of Daniel 11 on a line to see it. Okay, so that's the recap of last night. Any questions, comments, or observations? All right. So what I wanted, and we said other things last night, but that was a recap. What I was saying earlier, and I really never pulled the trigger on the complete thought, is we never knew that 1989 was the time of the end for, we never identified it, knew that it was the time of the end for our history. We never knew we were in a reform movement. These things are opening up to us and we're just teaching them. We never, there's several justifications for marking 1996 as a waymark. Okay, 1996 is a waymark of our history that has been typified by the formalization of the message of William Miller in 1831 or 1833, however you want to mark that. But that waymark's been typified by the work of John the Baptist, announcing that Christ is going to come. We never, when we're printing the Time of the End magazine, we had no idea whatsoever about those kind of connections. Those things came after the fact. In fact, the brother that, when we had those 12 articles in the Firm Foundation, they had a pretty good artist working for them at that time, and every article would have a picture on the opening of the article. Every article in the magazine would have artwork. And so the 12 articles of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 that went into those magazine over a 12-month period, they each had their own artwork at the beginning of the chapter that corresponded to the title of the chapter. Are you following me? So the brother that took those 12 articles and turned them into one standalone magazine, he took the 12 pieces of artwork and he made a collage out of them on the front page of the magazine, the cover of the magazine. And it wasn't anything purposeful, but there was one article called The Time of the End, and it just so happened that's what he plugged into the very top of that magazine. And so that magazine became known as the Time of the End magazine, just as a, just as a coincidence. And it was known as there it is. It was known as the Time of the End. That's went through some changes. It was known as the Time of the End magazine long before we understood that 1989 was the time of the end, in agreement with Daniel 11 verse 40. So what I'm saying is the things that we've come to understand about this reform line and these truths as human beings, as human beings, we didn't have any advance foreknowledge of these things. Okay, at that point we didn't understand that prophecy has both an internal and an external element. The Millerites did. The Millerites understood that the 7 seals paralleled the 7 churches, and that the history of the 7 churches is the internal experience of God's people, whereas the seals is the same history, but it's representing the external forces against God's people during that same history. So the Millerites understood internal, external. We didn't. There came a point in time when we did, and then we realized that, well, in 1996, the message is formalized. But we didn't realize that in 1996, that's when the Patriot Act was penned. It's not going to be put in place until 9/11/2001, but the Patriot Act was written in 1996 because what's going on with God's people internally is corresponding what's going on in the United States. Because the Seventh-day Adventist Church's probation closes when the probation for the United States closes, just as the probation for God's people in Egypt closed right there when probation closed for Pharaoh. Abram's prophecy says you're going to go into bondage and I will judge the country where you go at the very time that I bring you out. And the very time they brought him out was Passover, and Passover is an illustration of the close of probation for God's people. If you didn't put that blood on your doorpost, you and your family were lost. If you did, you were saved. Your probation was closed right when probation is closing for Egypt, typifying, all the prophets are speaking the end of the world, that when probation closes for Seventh-day Adventists here in the United States, the birthplace of Adventism, probation is going to close for the United States at the same time. So when the message for God's church is being published in 1996, the leaders of the United States are changing the very essence of the Constitution from English law to Roman law. It's still not going to be put in place until 2001, but the Patriot Act was written in 1996. There's other things about 1996, but we didn't recognize these things until after the fact. Okay, so I want you to understand that when I'm pointing out these things that I've had a personal experience in, I'm not trying to lead you to believe that I had any kind of special foreknowledge or insight. It's just you looking back and seeing what's happening, and you become aware, oh wow, that was a fulfillment of prophecy. So in our understanding, I better switch to black.
That's why it's historical events.
Historical
You're
events.
looking back to see how it corresponds to prophecy.
Yes, you're showing, but see now, did you understand what he said? Historical events are set before the people, something that's already taken place. But the issue is now, is that we're at a place where the Lord's going to expect us to give a prediction in advance. A prediction before midnight. And the prediction is that Russia is about to attack the United States and win. Okay, pretty profound prediction. So anyway, we've understood that verse 40 begins in 1798, because verse 40 of Daniel 7 says, and at the time of the end, yes?
So maybe we should say, attack American holdings and positions around the world, therefore attacking the United States, but not necessarily the homeland.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Repeat what they said.
Oh, boy.
No, verse 40 begins at the time of the end in 1798. It says, and at the time of the end, and in Great Controversy 356, Sister White defines the time of the end as 1798. Now, we got two things going now. What Brother Brian's thrown in the mix and what Brother Dave's thrown in the mix. Brother Brian is giving us the segue into the idea of speaking to historical events that have been fulfilled already, but bringing up the issue that we're going to be tested on our faith and understanding by our being given a message that we will be required to proclaim in advance. Okay? That's different. And the reason that we can do so is because we have followed on in the development of this prophetic message and become so familiar with it that we have faith in it and we can see these things happening, and we're going to be required to give a testimony to him. Now, Brother Dave, he's raising a different issue. He doesn't want me to say that verse 11 of Daniel 11, the Battle of Raphia, is necessarily that the United States, the continental United States, is going to suffer some kind of cataclysmic warfare from Russia and lose. He's wanting to suggest that maybe it's a cataclysmic loss that doesn't impact the continental United States so much. Until Penium. But I haven't seen any thus saith the Lord's on either side of that issue. So I'm just letting you know that I'm open for correction on either way at this point, but I'm watching the Lord develop this and trusting that He will bring it into clarity. But you can argue either side. You can argue even that the United States itself is going to suffer, particularly if you think about the second part B of Daniel 11:40. Daniel 11:40 begins at the time of the end in 1798, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Let's read it because it's not in my head. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, and horsemen and ships. Okay, so we mark this as 1989. So one of the things that we haven't taken too close attention to is something that happened in 1989. And rightly so, okay. But I want to point it out to you that in 1798 the book of Daniel was unsealed, and if you go back and you read books written by men like Uriah Smith and James White about the time of the end in 1798, they will tell you that in 1798 the book of Daniel was unsealed and that the Millerites had this understanding of Daniel 8:14 and Revelation 14:6 and 7 and Leviticus 26, and that the light of God's prophetic word shone out and led the Millerites to their conclusions. But if you read on, they're going to also point out that in 1798 you're seeing the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and knowledge with worldly things, steamships and telegraphs and so on and so forth, also exploded during that period of time. But as students of prophecy, we say, well, that at best is secondary, because we're looking for a spiritual fulfillment of this increase of knowledge, and to point to a literal fulfillment is kind of a denial of how you apply Scripture. But nevertheless, the Millerites also pointed to the increase of knowledge that went on in the, what would you call it, secular world or the industrial world during this time. So was there anything in 1989 that paralleled that? The internet. Okay. 1989, the internet comes into history. So when you look at people like Snowden over in Russia, the guy that developed the security system for the National Security Agency of the United States, the guy that developed that software or whatever, he wrote it all for him, and he's now living in Russia, then you can hypothesize that maybe this attack of Rafia includes cyber warfare. And the right kind of cyber war in the United States, it might not blow up a lot of buildings, but if all the hydroelectric dams in the United States quit working tomorrow, we would be in a crisis where people would die. Okay, you just would. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm saying that I agree with Dave that maybe it is a proxy war that is going to be carried out and the battle lost by the United States against Russia in fulfillment of Daniel 11:11, the Battle of Rafia. But I don't think we have a clear indication that it can't be something that takes place here in the United States as well. But 1989, time of the end for us, and we see the collapse of the Soviet Union. We now understand that part of this history is 1991, because we initially understood the time of the end was a point in time. We now understand it's a period of time, and we have about four, I'll say four, but I think it might be 5 witnesses to times of the end in the Scripture where you will see 2 kings or 2 personalities involved. In ours, it's Ronald Reagan in 1989. Both Ronald Reagan and George Bush the Greater were presidents in 1989. Okay, because George Bush is going to be inaugurated on January 20th, I think, 1989. So Reagan technically was a president for 19 days in 1989. But in 1991, and even in 1990, it's hard for me, the evidence that we have here recently, it's hard for me to be certain of this because of the date. But you all remember when George Bush the Greater says we are now entering into a new world order. Well, he did that on September 11th, 1991, but he also did it on September 11th, 1990. And I'm wondering if there's a typo in that historical confirmation. Was it 91 and someone typed in 1990 that some of us that are looking for these things pull it out? Did he do it twice? And if he did he do it on September 11th both times? Because that's what the historical data says. He announced, but I'm going to go with 1991 at this point. For certain, September 11th, 1991, he's announcing the introduction of a new world order. This is important for us because this is marking the time of the end. And in Daniel 11, verse 2, we have marked the time of the end in verse 1 of Daniel 11. And in verse 2 it says, and Cyrus is ruling. It says, there shall yet 3 kings stand up. Okay, George Bush the Greater was already there. So you have to have 3 kings after George Bush. And this is the Medes and the Persians, and every two-horn power in scriptures is typifying the two-horn power at the end of the world, which is the United States. So these Medo-Persian kings, yet 3 shall stand up, is Clinton, Bush the younger, Obama, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all are. That's putting us in here to where we are now in Trump time period, the 45th president of the United States. And we began to grapple with that a couple years ago, or a year ago, long before the election. And we had arguments about, well, is Trump really richer than the Clintons? Because the Clintons got so many millions stashed in little squirrel holes around the world that maybe they're richer than Trump. Or does it mean that the president is the rich one, or is it talking about the United States being the richest? And we started grappling with these things. And then Trump gets elected. But our original understanding of the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 is that this here is the history of verse 40. And we knew from other prophetic understandings that there were other waymarks that were going to take place in the history of verse 40. Okay, but we knew here that at the Sunday law in the United States, that this is verse 41. Okay, so this history here, we could see in Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And we knew of other waymarks, such as, I'll put 96 in here only because we've been speaking about it. But we came to understand 9/11. But this here that we were understanding, it was from the book of Revelation. It was from other lines of prophecy. It wasn't from Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. But when the Lord removed his hand from verse 10 of Daniel 11, then we could recognize 2 more waymarks. And those waymarks correspond to verse 11. Now when I say verse 11 and 12 go together, but verse 11 is the Battle of Raphia. Okay? And this waymark corresponds to verse 15. And when I say verse 15, I know that verses 13, 14, and 15 go together, but the actual Battle of Paneum is verse 15. So what we discover here with these 2 battles is that the vision of Daniel 11 itself has now provided 2 waymarks that come before verse 16, because you can show very clearly that verse 16 is the Sunday law. Okay, so what the Lord, when he removes his hand from verse 10, which is what allows you to recognize verse 11 and onward correctly, then you see 2 waymarks that come before the Sunday law. And we'd already come to understand that the waymark before the Sunday law is the midnight cry. And the waymark before the midnight cry is midnight. Okay, now you could argue that maybe one of these waymarks was 9/11, but 9/11, the history of 9/11 doesn't correspond to the history that's illustrated in verses 11 through 15. So you have to rule that one out, which leaves you with midnight and the midnight cry. What that does is it provides a story for you and I to recognize we're over here in this history. We're in between 9/11 and midnight. And the Lord has now removed his hand from verse 10 and given us the ability to see that what's coming is verse 11 through 15. A battle between Russia and the United States that initially Russia wins, and then ultimately the United States prevails. But it's being revealed to us in advance. Okay, so it's bringing with us the responsibility to give a prediction before midnight. And when we go back to Millerite history, which is being repeated to the very letter, we see that the message of the midnight cry, the 7th seal, that before midnight, before Boston, and before the midnight cry that followed in Exeter, that Samuel Snow has already published the message of the midnight cry before midnight. There has to be a prediction before midnight here in order to agree with the principle that we're repeating the Millerite history to the very letter. So, if this is true, what we're looking at is the midnight cry message that every other midnight cry message in sacred history pointed forward to. This is the great anti-type. Because you know the midnight cry message of the Millerite history, that Sister White uses the history of the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem and says the triumphal entry of Christ in Jerusalem is what is paralleling and typifying the midnight cry message of the Millerites. So every one of these historical biblical examples that are pointing forward to the midnight cry are pointing forward to this message, because this is the close of judgment. So this is big stuff. Everyone with me?
Could you back up just a minute?
Back up a
You're
minute.
saying the triumphal entry of Christ points forward to the midnight cry?
Of the Millerite history.
Okay.
And they give two witnesses to the midnight cry of our history.
And do you mind also just, I don't want to slow everybody.
Now, I want to tell you something. My brother here, he's been away from this message for some years, and last night he and I had a discussion, and I told him, I didn't come here this Sabbath to preach. I came here to teach. So as long as the questions aren't asking me what my grandson's middle name is, if it's a question that has to do with what we're studying, I don't care about taking questions along the way. And then Sister Kathy told me, well, that's okay to do it as long as I repeat the questions before I answer them. So help me repeat the questions before I answer them so it gets recorded.
So you've made several references last night and today to Daniel 11:10.
So I've made several references to Daniel 11:10.
Could we turn to that reference?
That's where I was going next.
Okay, because you said the Lord removed his hand.
Yes,
That is-
I'm glad you're getting pricked in the heart about that. If there's anything I want to stimulate our sanctified curiosity over is the claim that Brother Jeff is making about verse 10 of Daniel 11. Is it valid? Because if it is, this is something I need to understand.
So it's a parallel, verse 10 with 11:40. Is that correct? Will you show that?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a parallel to the
History.
I'm saying that the Lord allowing us to see verse 10 correctly as of December last year was typified by the Lord removing his hand from a mistake in the figures on the 1843 chart, which allowed the Millerites to have the point of reference to develop the midnight cry message. So when the Lord removed his hand from verse 10 of Daniel 11, it allowed us to see that Russia was still active as the king of the South, and in so doing, it allowed us to correctly understand what is represented in verses 10 through 16. In fact, all the way 10 through 39. And so verse 10 is a parallel. It's where the Lord is removing his hand from a mistake that we had in our foundational message, just like the mistake the Millerites had in their foundational message. Theirs was 1843. Ours was that Russia was out of the prophetic scenario after 1989.
Just like the disciples had made a mistake too,
Yes.
in the nature of Christ's kingdom.
Yes, and in misunderstanding prophecy,
So you're not repeating what he's saying, so it's like...
yes, just like the disciples, he's saying, just like the disciples, he had a misunderstanding in the nature of Christ's kingdom. That got clarified for them when he clarified it for them. But on the road to Emmaus, it even mentions that those disciples, how's it say, he had withholden their understanding, implying he had his hand over their understanding of prophecy until a certain point in time, then he removed it. And he did that with Ellen White also.
So in partial answer to
In partial answer to
Brian's question.
Brian's question,
It's a rule of first and last.
It's a rule of first and last.
That when the first part of Rome being set up in the first part of Daniel 11 is what's happening with the hand being removed as Rome being set up at the end of Daniel 11.
That when Rome is being set up in the first part of Daniel 11, his hand being removed is identifying Rome being set up in the last part of Daniel 11. I'm not sure that, did I express your comment right?
Close.
Close. I'm not sure that I understand it, but I expressed it correctly.
Because the Battle of Raphia and Panium, Rome comes out of hiding, and it's really about Rome. With the battle being
Okay,
inside.
yeah, and the Battle of Panium, Rome comes out of hiding, so it's really about Rome coming back into history, modern Rome.
That's what's opening up between 40 and 41.
Yes. Okay. But he doesn't understand that yet unless he's studied some things on the internet. So you just went over his head, but you're probably everyone else, or several others may understand what you're saying. But we'll try to explain that as we proceed. Sister.
Because it says overflow and pass through.
We'll go through that right now. She's asking the question about what links them, and she went to overflow and pass through. I think I've been speaking for an hour right now, correct? Okay, I'll go a little bit longer, and what I'm going to do for you, you know, Brother Dave in his introduction, he said something that I agree with, but he pointed back here, that's gone now. 1989, the first thing that the Lord opened up to us was the reform lines, okay? And he went to Miller's fourth rule and says the third scriptural reference is Isaiah 28, verses 10 through 14, line upon line. That's all correct, okay? But we didn't understand that until after 9/11. Okay, we did. After 9/11, we began to grapple with the idea of what is the latter rain. Because, and going back to the old past, and in Jeremiah 6:16, when you start going back to the old past to understand the old past, it says, stand ye in the way and see, and ask for the old past, where is the good way, and walk ye therein, and you shall find rest to your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein. So after 9/11, we're getting drawn into these biblical passages that the latter rain begins to sprinkle at 9/11. And we get led to Isaiah 28 long after 1996 or 1989. And we begin to see that the latter rain message is taught line upon line. That's what Isaiah 28 teaches. The latter rain message, the latter rain is a message we came to understand. And we came to understand that the way that you teach it and understand it is line upon line. And Miller had addressed that, but none of the Millerites ever took the understanding of line upon line that we employ to the level that we take it to. But even when we were being taught this truth in 1989 and onward, we didn't understand the significance of it until long after 9/11. Okay, so there are 14 rules that the Lord gave to the Millerites in order to allow them to put together their message. And there are rules that He has given to us at the end that allow us to put together our message. The rules that we have do not contradict Miller's rules. Some of them are, like Brother Dave was bringing out, they're an expansion of Miller's rules. He never took line upon line to the level that we do. But I'm suggesting that if we don't become familiar with these rules, then we don't have the ability to give the prediction before midnight, because in order to give the prediction before midnight, you don't just have to have the intellectual understanding, you're going to have faith that what you're saying is true, and your faith is going to be based upon the familiarity of handling these rules that the Lion of the tribe of Judah has given you as a legacy, if that's the right word, of His covenant people at the end of the world. So these rules, one of them that came about is a triple application of prophecy. I just doubt that the Millerites, they may believe like we do, that would fit into a definition of a triple application of prophecy, but they didn't deal with a triple application of prophecy. And a triple application of prophecy, if you don't know what it is, at some point in time maybe we'll share it today. But that rule is based upon another rule, and it's upon the testimony of two or three, but a testimony of two is all you need, is to establish something. Okay, throughout the scriptures, upon the testimony of two or three, a thing is established. A triple application of prophecy is based upon the fact that the first time a prophecy is fulfilled, combined with the second time that same prophecy is fulfilled, will define the third and final fulfillment of that prophecy. Okay, so you don't have a triple application of prophecy without the principle that upon two or three a thing is established. So I'm finding as I go through the first 39 verses of Daniel 11 that the Lion of the tribe of Judah has purposely incorporated these rules that he's been training us to understand since 1989 onward. Okay, so when it comes to one of the most important rules of our history, and it's a rule that is referenced in William Miller's rule, upon the testimony of two or three a thing is established. But all you really need is two in God's Word. You can't make a doctrine off of one reference. But if you have two, providing that you're understanding and applying it correctly, it's established. So if you go to Daniel 11:10, I'm skipping over some verses that would put some background into it, and we'll do that in our next presentation. I don't know that it's good that I do it in the next presentation, but probably most of us have went over the first 39 verses of Daniel 11 here recently. And we'll come back over them here in a moment, but I'm jumping forward to verse 10. And verse 10 is typifying the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. And we can show you that more easily if we go through the first 9 verses, all right? So verse 10 of Daniel 11 says this: "But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress." So in verse 6 through 9, in verses 6 through 9, the king of the south has sought to have a peace treaty with the king of the north. And the peace treaty is represented by the king giving his daughter, Berenice, to the king of the north in order to form this peace treaty. But in order for the king of the north to marry this king of the south's daughter, he has to set aside his wife, Laodice. Okay? And his wife doesn't like that very much. So there comes a point in time where his wife, Laodice, is going to retaliate and kill Bernice, the bride that was given from Egypt to the northern king. And when she's killed, her brothers back in Egypt, they're irritated. Okay, big time. They want to go retaliate against the king of the south, Ptolemy. Have I got this reversed? Am I getting this?
There was one brother.
Yeah.
One brother.
Yeah, well, no, it starts with 2, but it ends up with 1 going there.
I thought that was the king of the north who had 2 sons that.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm kicking this around, and I shouldn't be doing it. I should have just went through the verses point by point, and then I could have walked it through in a logical fashion. When you get, pardon me.
You still can.
Yeah, I will in the next presentation. I'm just trying to summarize the lead into verse 10. In verse 10, what you have is the retaliation of the king of the north against the king of the south for this broken peace treaty in the previous verses. Let's keep it simple at that at this point, all right? So there's two king of the north that initially that are going to take up this response to the king of the south. And it says, "But his sons," this is the 2 sons, "shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come." Okay, so there's 2 of them involved, but it's going to be one that actually accomplishes it ultimately. And when you go into history, you'll see in 1989 there are 2 men involved that this is typifying. Reagan, followed by Bush the Greater. Okay? "And when they come, they shall overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress." Now, there are at least 3 elements that you have to see in here in verse 10. That's probably too light, right? Verse 10. the expression overflow, Passover, and Passover. And this is a war between the king of the south and the king of the north. But who's going to win? The king of the north is going to prevail. Okay, so it's a war between the king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the north is going to win this conflict. But in the verse it says he's going to go up to his fortress. Is that how it says it? Even to his fortress?
To his fortress. No.
To his fortress.
Stirred up to his fortress.
Okay, I'm looking for to his fortress.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so you have to see that. These are the three elements I think you need to see. Okay, overflow and Passover. It's a battle between the king of the south and the king of the north, which the king of the north is going to win. And he's only going to go to his fortress. But if you go back to verse 7, when the king of the south has retaliated against the betrayal of Bernice, when Laodice executes Bernice and her son, when the king of the south retaliates, in verse 7, it says this. Towards the end. It says, but out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up. This is her brother in his estate, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress. Okay? You got to see this distinction. In verse 7, he goes into his fortress. Now history tells us when the southern kingdom attacks the northern kingdom here in verse 7 for executing Bernice, the peace offering that was given to them, that when they come to do battle with the king of the north, he provides no resistance whatsoever. He knows he's outmanned or whatever, so they walk right into his castle. They walk right into his castle, take him captive without any resistance, and take him back to Egypt where he dies in exile. So when it says into his fortress, it means into his fortress. He went right into his castle. And we haven't been there yet, but this is typifying when Berthier walks right into the Vatican without any resistance and takes the Pope captive, okay? And takes him to exile where he dies in exile, just like this king does. But in verse 10, he doesn't go into his fortress, he comes even to his fortress. Okay, there's a distinction. If this is the fortress, if you're going to go into it, you're going to go all the way in here. But if you're just going to come up to it, you go to there. You see the distinction? All right, so if you go to Daniel 11 verse 40, which is the history that we're living in, it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And the king of the north shall come against him. This is the retaliation here. The king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. This overflow and pass over in verse 40 is the identical Hebrew word as verse 10, even though pass through. Okay, but it's identical. In Hebrew, it's identical. Okay, it's just been translated by the King James translators a little bit differently in verse 10 and verse 40, but it's the same Hebrew. Okay, it's also a war between the king of the south and the king of the north, where the king of the north is going to prevail. Okay, the Soviet Union is going to be swept away. But it says he's going to pass over the countries, but it doesn't say any more than that. It doesn't say whether he's going to enter into his fortress or up to his fortress. It's kind of vague in verse 40. But at least now in verse 10 and verse 40, you have two witnesses of two verses. That's a war between the king of the north and the king of the south, that the king of the north prevails, and all the prophets are speaking about the end of the world more than the days in which they lived. And you're seeing a connection between these two verses because what's here is the identical expression, overflow and pass over. So go to Isaiah 7 for one more witness. and then we'll put this in place, and then we'll take a break. Isaiah 7. Now, I really want to go to Isaiah 8, but I want you to see something in Isaiah 7 first. And it's right out of the prophecy of the 2520. Isaiah 7 is where the 2520, the starting point for both 2520s is marked. And let's start in verse 3. I mean, Ahaz is a wicked king. He realized that he's the king of the south. Ahaz is the king of the south, and this is a story about the king of the south. Okay? And he realized that the northern kingdom of Israel has formed a confederacy with Syria, and they're going to come against him. So Ahaz is in trouble, because the king of the south, it's only 2 countries. It's Benjamin and Judah, and the northern kingdom is 10 tribes, plus Syria. So he's outgunned, he's outmanned. Verse 3, Isaiah sent to give him some counsel. It says, Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field, and say unto him, Take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted. For the 2 tales of these smoking firebrands, the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria, and the son of Remaliah, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against thee, saying, Let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. So Isaiah presents the problem that Ahaz knows that he's in. Rezin, the king of Syria, along with the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, are coming to attack Ahaz, the king of Judah, the king of the south. And then verse 7 is the prophecy. This isn't going to stand. It says, Isaiah says, Thus saith the Lord God, It shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. But now here's a principle upon 2 witnesses that you need to see. It says, For the head of Syria is Damascus. What is Syria? What's Damascus? It's the capital of that country. If it said the head of the United States is Washington, D.C., it would be a fair application. It says, For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Or you could say, the head of the United States is Washington, D.C., and the head of Washington, D.C. is Donald Trump. That's what's being said here. This country's capital city has a king over it, which is Rezin. All right, so let me read it again now that I've given you the idea there. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. Now here's the second witness to this principle, verse 9. And the head of Ephraim, what is Ephraim? It's a country composed of 10 tribes. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria. What's Samaria? It's the capital city of Israel, the northern kingdom. For the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Okay. What does that mean? What do you got to believe there? Do you have to believe the 2520 prophecy? Well, probably so. But you also need to believe, I would think, why is that in there? You need to believe that the head of a country is the capital, and the head of the capital is the king. Because you got 2 witnesses to it there, of both Syria and Israel. You see that? Okay, so Ahaz, he's going to hear this warning from Isaiah, and he's going to reject it, because Ahaz is a wicked, wicked, wicked guy. Okay, he's the head of the king of Judah, but he's wicked. He sent his high priest up into Assyria and had his high priest make a blueprint of this Syrian temple, pagan temple, and then come back to Jerusalem and rebuild a duplicate Assyrian temple right in the courtyard of God's temple. And he shuts down God's temple and puts this pagan temple right in the courtyard. That's wickedness. I don't know how to explain that kind of wickedness. So he's got a problem. He's rejected this message of Isaiah. Okay? So Isaiah is going to reach a point in chapter 8 where he's saying, okay, because you've rejected this message, and the message he's rejected is illustrated by the pool of Siloam. Only in the Old Testament, Siloam of the New Testament is called Shiloah. And the waters of Shiloah are the waters of Siloam, and it's the latter rain message at the end of the world. Because the leadership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church has implemented spiritual formation right in the courtyard of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they are simultaneously rejecting the latter rain message represented by Shiloah and Siloam, and represented as the old paths, of which the 20 that are both there in that prophecy are a symbol of the old paths, because there's a group in Adventism, when you're called to return to the old paths, say, we will not walk therein. So Ahaz here is going to be, a judgment's going to be pronounced against them because you reject these waters that run softly. Then I'm going to send the waters of the Euphrates against you, and the waters of the Euphrates is the waters representing the king of the north. Okay, so I'm going to cut into this pronouncement against Ahaz now in chapter 8. Verse 5. The Lord said also unto me again, saying, forasmuch as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloah that go softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth upon them the waters of the river strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks, and he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over. This overflow and go over is the identical Hebrew that's in verse 10 and verse 40. Now who's the king of Assyria? He's the king of the north. Who's he coming against? He's coming against Ahaz. Who's Ahaz? The king of the south. So you have a war between the king of the south and the king of the north that's being illustrated. And the king of Assyria, he's going to prevail in this war. But that's not all. It says in verse 8, and he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the threshing out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. When was this fulfilled? You all know this story. You may not know, you know the story, but you may not know the story is the fulfillment of this verse. But you remember the story of Sennacherib sending his general to Jerusalem, and Isaiah and Shebna and Hilkiah were on the walls of Jerusalem, and they were saying to Rabshakeh, speak to us in Babylonian and Chaldean. We understand Chaldean. Quit blaspheming the Lord in the Hebrew language. You remember that story? And that night, an angel of the Lord killed 180,000, correct me if I'm wrong, Assyrian army that night. But what happened in this story with Sennacherib in fulfillment of this prophecy? It swept over all the land. It takes all of Judah, all of Benjamin. It comes right up to the neck. What's the neck? If you come up to the neck, what is left? The capital. What's the capital? Jerusalem. Okay, so in Isaiah 8:8, you have the identical characteristics of Daniel 11:10 and Daniel 11:40. You have the expression of overflow and Passover. You have a war between the king of the south and the king of the north, with Sennacherib. The king of the north is going to prevail in this war. But in verse 40, you don't have much. But in verse 10 and verse 8 of Isaiah 8, you have him come to his fortress. He doesn't, in that history, he didn't go and conquer Egypt. He left Egypt standing in the history of verse 10. Verse 40 doesn't say much. But here in 8, he comes up to the neck. Is that how it says? Even if it doesn't say it that way, you know what I mean.
Even to the neck.
Even to the neck. Thus providing two witnesses that in Daniel 11 verse 40, when the Soviet Union was swept away, he passed over the countries, but he only came up to the neck, up to his fortress, which means the Lord held his hand over our understanding of the sweeping away of the king of the south. We thought they were all swept away. They were done in history. The king of the south was gone. Gorbachev has moved to the next dragon power of the United Nations, and we were wrong. Russia was still there as the king of the south. And in the next verses, you're going to see the king of the south attack the king of the north, and the king of the north retaliate against that attack. But it demands that you understand that the king of the north in the next verse is Russia, which is a pretty scary proposition.
The king of the south or north?
What did I say? Ah, no. Good for you. The king of the south is Russia. That would have really thrown you, huh? Okay. Keep your eye on me. I do that kind of stuff a lot.
The next verse is Isaiah 8:9.
And the next verse you want me to read about Isaiah 8:9. Associate yourselves, O you people, and you shall be broken in pieces, and give ear, all you far countries. Gird yourself, and you shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourself, and you shall be broken in pieces. So go ahead. Tell me what you want to say about that verse.
No. You said in the next verse, and then he corrected.
No. I meant verse 11 of Daniel 11.
Okay.
In the next verse, Russia, the king of the south, is going to retaliate against the king of the north, who we are identifying as the United States, and they're going to win. Just after that, what are you saying?
It's a doubling.
What is?
Verse 9.
Okay, I thought that's what she was getting at. We're going to verse 9 of Isaiah 8. So we want to make this point. Show me the doubling in verse 9, because this always comes up.
Says, shall ye be broken in pieces, break yourself, you shall be broken in pieces and broken in pieces. That's 3.
That's 3. Gird yourself is a doubling, if you want to go there, but we're not going to verse 9. Shall we pray?